It was 1945. The Reich had ceased to exist, but its corpse was still bleeding. German cities, Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, Königsberg, were not cities anymore. They were open graves. There was no water. There was no electricity. There was no order. Mothers boiled potato peels, grass, even brick dust to quiet the pain of hunger. The war had entered every home. Defeat had sunk into every bone. On the edges of Berlin, women dragged carts carrying children under sheets. Some were asleep, some were dead. A few women still wore torn party dresses, the only clothes left unburned. The concept of home had dissolved. Walls no longer protected. Streets led nowhere. Neighbors watched each other, not out of trust, but out of hunger and fear. To understand how civilian life reached this point, we must go back to 1933, Berlin, the morning of 30th of January. Winter was gray. Trams screeched across frozen rails. The radio announced with restraint that President Hindenburg had appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of the Reich. To some, it was just another change in a line of unstable governments. To others, it was the beginning of redemption. That night, the Brandenburg Gate glowed with torchlight. Thousands paraded down Unter den Linden, flags waving, families leaning from balconies as though witnessing a holy procession. Inflation, unemployment, the humiliation of Versailles, all seemed finally to retreat. It did not feel like war. It felt like salvation. In working-class neighborhoods, reactions were mixed. Some remembered beatings from brown shirts and looked with suspicion, but hunger left little room for suspicion. Maybe now things will change, people whispered. The lower middle class, clerks, shopkeepers, pensioners, embraced the new order fastest. They had lost most in the chaos of the 20s. When Hitler spoke of unity, order, and dignity, they heard the return of stability. Change showed itself in small gestures. Hindenburg's portrait was replaced by Hitler's in schools. Children learned the raised arm salute in playgrounds. Merchants quietly removed foreign goods. Priests spoke of national rebirth. No laws yet, no uniforms for all, but a new language was settling. Destiny, pride, exclusion. Radios sold in waves. The cheap People's Receiver carried Hitler's voice into kitchens, barbershops, and workshops. Many who had never read Mein Kampf found themselves convinced. He sounded sharp, prophetic, certain. In times of crisis, certainty is persuasive. Youth groups grew quickly. Boys entered the Hitler Youth, girls the League of German Girls. Many joined not from conviction, but from a desire to belong, to wear the badges, sing the songs, march in the woods. At home, hope-colored conversations. Jokes about Jews, once whispered, were told aloud. A shop window sign, Aryan business, might appear, not from ideology, but because the neighbor had one. Silence in the new order was suspicious. On May Day, instead of workers' marches, there were fireworks and patriotic shows. The next morning, independent unions were dissolved into the German Labor Front. Workers' freedom ended quietly, while crowds still celebrated in the streets. By the end of that first year, promises began to look like achievements. Jobs returned through public works, trains ran on time, streets looked cleaner. People believed the nation was healing. By 1934, the mood of celebration began to harden into discipline. The parades, the flags, the radio speeches, they did not disappear. They became routine. Germany was being reshaped under Gleichschaltung, the coordination of every individual with the ideals of the state. In every neighborhood, a new figure appeared, the block leader. He might be a shopkeeper, a retiree, or a porter. His past did not matter. His task was simple: to watch, to record, to report. He knew the names of his neighbors, and they knew his. He did not need to say much. His presence alone was enough to steer conversation into safe, permitted lines. Parents learned to measure their words. Children returned from school singing songs of loyalty, repeating slogans, asking why greetings at home were not the same as greetings in class. Teachers had been absorbed into the National Socialist Teachers League. Lessons were rewritten. History began with the greatness of the First World War and ended with Hitler's rise. The Weimar years were brushed aside. Biology explained racial differences. Arithmetic calculated the supposed cost of keeping the hereditarily ill. Education was no longer about questions, it was about obedience. Workplaces changed too. Free trade unions had been abolished. Every worker was folded into the German labor front. Wages were no longer negotiated. Strikes ended overnight. In factories, people worked more and spoke less. Advancement depended not only on skill, but on party loyalty. who saluted first, who donated most, who hung the flag in the window. Women were pushed into a carefully defined role. Through women's leagues and associations, they were praised as mothers, guardians of the home, and bearers of future soldiers. Meetings promised community, but always included slogans, songs, and training. The ideal woman was strong, fertile, obedient. Those who worked outside the home were reminded that their true battlefield was the kitchen and the nursery. Leisure was also reorganized. The Strength Through Joy organization offered cheap holidays, theater tickets, lectures, even cruises. For many, it was the first chance to see the sea or travel abroad. But each excursion came with ideological lectures, patriotic songs, party stewards who recorded behavior. Rest was no longer private. It was another instrument of unity and control. The press was silenced. Independent papers disappeared or were absorbed by publishers loyal to the regime. Reading the newspaper became predictable. All stories were good news. The economy rose, the Führer was adored, the nation was strong. Bad news was not printed. Foreign broadcasts could sometimes be picked up, but listening was a risk. To be caught could mean prison. In June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives sent a darker message. The SA, the stormtroopers who had once built Hitler's movement, were purged. Ernst Röhm and others were executed on direct orders. Officially, it was described as a defense of order. Many civilians accepted it without question. Crime, they told themselves, was justified if it served the nation. Justice and obedience had become the same word. That August, President Hindenburg died. Hitler united the roles of head of state and head of government. A plebiscite followed. The vote was not free. Ballots were watched. Pressure was heavy. But most still voted yes. Democracy, already fragile, was buried without ceremony. What mattered most to the majority was not liberty. It was stability. By 1935, the atmosphere of Germany was already transformed. Streets were saturated with symbols, swastikas draped from buildings, uniforms visible everywhere, Hitler's portrait hanging in schools, stations, even shop windows. Civil life had become a parade, carefully choreographed, watched, and measured. But a new stage was beginning: the legal exclusion of Jews. On the 15th of September 1935, during the Party Congress in Nuremberg, two laws were announced: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. With them, Jews ceased to be citizens. They lost the right to vote, to hold office, to marry, or even have relations with non-Jews. Beyond the text of the law, the true change was atmospheric. Exclusion became official. It was not whispered or implied. It was written, stamped, enforced. Everyday life quickly adjusted. In cafes, Jewish customers disappeared, some forced out, others understanding they were no longer welcome. Shopkeepers who continued to sell to Jewish neighbors received warnings or visits from brown shirts. Aryan businesses displayed signs to prove their loyalty. Pharmacies were checked to ensure they did not fill prescriptions from Jewish doctors. In schools, Jewish children were increasingly isolated, first ignored, then insulted, eventually segregated. Headmasters reported how many non-Aryan pupils remained. Biology classes taught skull measurements, racial science, and the idea of degeneration. At recess, games no longer included everyone. Mockery, spitting, and shoving became daily lessons in exclusion. Cultural life was reshaped. Jewish actors, musicians, and professors were dismissed. Contracts canceled. Chairs annulled. Lists of names were published. The cleansing of German life was not hidden. It was announced and even celebrated. Cinemas stopped showing films with Jewish performers. Bookstores removed authors. Universities lost entire faculties. Neighbors who had once shared dinners and birthdays now looked away. Not always out of conviction, often out of fear. A smile at the wrong person, a visit to the wrong home, could be observed. The block leader would take note. One anonymous denunciation was enough to lose a job, or worse. So silence became survival. For Jewish families, the consequences were intimate and immediate. Parents explained why children could no longer go to the same school, why they were no longer invited to birthdays, why some shops shut their doors. Some tried to maintain routines, reading, visiting grandparents, writing letters, but each day brought refusals and closed doors. Others began to plan for emigration, though visas and destinations were increasingly hard to obtain. The world outside was not opening, it was closing. For the majority of Germans, exclusion became normal. Many did not think about it. They simply carried on. Some even celebrated it. Propaganda justified everything. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in 1918, for cultural degeneration, for international conspiracy. Children's magazines carried caricatures. Newsreels echoed the message. Repeated so often, the words lost weight. Few argued against them. Most had learned not to argue at all. The silence of neighbors, the indifference of colleagues, the absence of protest, these things allowed exclusion to grow. The system of Gleichschaltung had not only coordinated institutions, it was coordinating consciences. By 1936, ordinary Germans knew what to say, when to stay quiet, what to look at, and what to avoid. Life went on, orderly, clean, efficient, but built on the vanishing of their neighbors. By the mid-1930s, German daily life was saturated with symbols and rituals. Every street corner bore red flags. Uniforms filled the pavements. Radios carried speeches into every apartment. Civilian life became a theater where appearances mattered as much as conviction. From childhood onward, Germans were shaped by propaganda. In nurseries, games and songs praised loyalty to the Führer. Teachers trained in racial science taught the purity of blood alongside arithmetic and grammar. History lessons began with ancient Germanic glory and ended with Hitler's rise. Geography described lost territories as promises for the future. Biology and maths carried messages about race and eugenics. Children grew up in a world where every drawing, every poem, every exercise reinforced a single message: obedience, strength, destiny. At the age of 10, boys entered the Hitler Youth, girls the League of German Girls. Free time was no longer truly free. Afternoons were for drills, hikes, games with knives, patriotic songs. Weekends meant camping trips or visits to battle memorials. Holidays were spent in party camps. Even birthdays were celebrated with salutes and hymns. At home, many parents encouraged this. Others feared refusing. To deny a child membership was to invite suspicion. Stories spread of children denouncing their own parents for careless words. These tales were used to inspire loyalty, but also to spread fear. In this new morality, devotion to the state was greater than devotion to family. Mass culture was an instrument of control. Radios carried only approved music and speeches. Newspapers did not inform but instructed. Cinema became a tool of seduction. Comedies, melodramas, even historical dramas were wrapped in nationalist messages. Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will showed hypnotic crowds, endless parades, and Hitler descending as if from the heavens. It contained little violence, but its aesthetics made obedience appear beautiful. Sport, too, was harnessed. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were staged as a showcase of strength and order. Flags lined streets, stadiums gleamed, the world was dazzled by discipline and spectacle. Anti-Jewish signs were quietly removed for foreign visitors. Even a handful of Jewish athletes were allowed to compete, as a calculated gesture. For a brief time, Germany appeared tolerant, modern, triumphant. But when the visitors departed, the mask slipped back. The machinery of exclusion resumed. Daily life became a parade of rituals. Weddings included Aryan ceremonies devised by the SS. Birthdays opened with patriotic songs. Christmas cards were printed with runes and party symbols. In schools, lessons began with the Nazi salute. In train stations, posters urged citizens to watch for internal enemies. There were no neutral spaces. Even trivial objects carried messages. Matchboxes with slogans, notebooks with Hitler's portrait, calendars marked with party anniversaries. Culture itself was narrowed to fit ideology. Jazz was banned as degenerate. Modern art disappeared from galleries. Architecture became monumental and cold. Everyday life was wrapped in banners, songs, salutes, and suspicion. Leisure, too, was controlled. The Strength Through Joy program offered workers cheap concerts, guided tours, even cruises to Norway. But every excursion was monitored. Speeches and songs punctuated each outing. Holidaymakers returned not just with photographs, but with reinforced loyalty. The countryside, the mountains, the sea, all were reframed as symbols of German destiny. Travel became a patriotic act. Maps pointed to sites of national heritage or Nazi triumphs. Even rest was politicized. When war began on 1 September 1939, civilians were prepared. Radios carried Hitler's announcement that German troops had crossed into Poland. The tone was calm, certain, justifying the action as self-defense. Crowds did not erupt into panic. There was no protest. Families gathered at stations to send off sons and husbands, waving, saluting, hiding tears. Women were mobilized to knit, to sew, to collect for soldiers. Posters covered walls with slogans of unity and duty. Rationing began at once. Bread, meat, fat, sugar, even soap were distributed by coupons. Housewives queued at dawn, ration books in hand. Coffee vanished, replaced by barley substitutes. Blackouts blanketed cities each night. Windows were covered with paper, street lamps extinguished. Cars drove with dimmed lights. Families taped windows to guard against blasts. Bombs had not yet fallen, but people lived as though they had. The first victories seemed to prove propaganda true. Poland collapsed in weeks. France followed in 6. The Netherlands, Belgium, Norway all fell quickly. By 1940, German maps stretched from the Pyrenees to the Arctic. Civilians marked advances with pins and kitchen maps. Children learned new foreign names as if they were their own. Radios trumpeted each success. Many believed the Führer invincible. Yet daily life hardened. Scarcity grew. Queues lengthened. Bread was darker, thinner, meat rarer, soap almost gone. Housewives learned to stretch every ingredient, to patch clothes until they could no longer hold a stitch. The black market became vital. A cigarette could buy an egg. A coat might be exchanged for bacon. Women cycled miles to the countryside, returning with potatoes hidden in baskets, fearing police checks. Authorities raided markets, issued fines, held trials. But the market persisted because even officials used it. Schools and youth organizations deepened militarization. Boys drilled with rifles. Girls were sent to farms or hospitals. Leisure disappeared. Childhood narrowed to uniforms and slogans. Women carried heavier burdens, working in factories, driving trams, staffing offices, then queuing for food and sewing at night. They were praised as soldiers of the home front. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. At first, the news was triumphant. Endless prisoners, captured cities, rapid advances. Families pushed pins further east across their maps. But soon, letters from the front hinted at bitter cold, endless distances, fierce resistance. Mothers read between the lines. They folded the letters carefully, hiding their fears. To repeat them aloud was dangerous. By 1942, illusions had collapsed. The war stretched on with no end. Scarcity became permanent. Meat disappeared from markets. Butter became a rarity. Bread was padded with husks and fillers. Beer was watered down. Housewives cooked ersatz meals, stretching ingredients with roots and substitutes. Official manuals taught how to boil legumes twice, how to mix coffee with acorns, how to cook without fat. Posters urged, nothing must be wasted. Kitchens and laundries became the civilian front line. But official rations were not enough. The black market expanded further. Barter replaced money. A bottle of liquor might buy 2 loaves of bread. Farmers were besieged by visitors from bombed cities. Trains were crowded with people smuggling potatoes or eggs under coats. Inspections grew harsher, but the trade continued. Survival was worth the risk. Women worked double shifts, replacing men in factories, hospitals, offices. They raised children alone, ran households, and slept in their clothes, ready for the air raid siren. Childhood itself was consumed. Teenagers labored in fields or munitions plants. The Hitler Youth became a military school. Girls were dispatched to nurseries and hospitals. Play vanished. Letters from the front carried veiled truths: mud, frost, exhaustion. Families read them silently, never repeating what they suspected. The Ministry of Propaganda demanded optimism. Doubt was buried in private drawers. At the same time, deportations accelerated. From 1942, Jewish families were rounded up and sent east under the language of resettlement. Neighbors watched them disappear. Their apartments were reassigned, their furniture distributed, their clothes reused. Silence did the rest. Most civilians did not ask questions. Many suspected, few spoke. In February 1943, defeat could no longer be denied. The Sixth Army was destroyed at Stalingrad. Official broadcasts dressed the disaster as heroic sacrifice, but families understood. Telegrams arrived. Chairs at dinner tables were left empty. Mourning spread behind curtains, restrained, silent. Too much grief could be judged unpatriotic. Condolences came with pamphlets. Your son fell for Germany. Goebbels sought to transform despair into fury. At Berlin's Sportpalast, he demanded total war. His words echoed through radios. More labor, more sacrifice, more discipline. The audience roared. But it was not joy. It was fear and desperation. Workplaces tightened further. Every screw and valve was declared vital to survival. Mistakes punished, effort rewarded with certificates or mentions in newspapers. Boys in the Hitler Youth trained with weapons. Girls were mobilized for farms and hospitals. Childhood ended in discipline. Rumors spread quietly. Blankets muffled radios tuned to foreign stations. Neighbors whispered of Soviet advances, of Allied bombings, of trains that never returned. The state denied everything. Few believed anymore. But silence remained safer than truth. Cities grew darker, colder, hungrier. Recycling campaigns demanded bones, paper, cooking fat. Workers obeyed, but morale thinned. Hospitals filled with mutilated soldiers, presented as heroes of sacrifice. Their broken bodies told another story. Families feared their sons would join them. The word on everyone's lips became Durchhalten, endure. Not with hope, but because no alternative remained. By 1944, war consumed every city. Bombs fell daily. Sirens split nights. Families rushed to basements with bundles of bread and documents. In the dark, they sat for hours, listening to the hum of bombers and the whistle of falling explosives. When it ended, streets were rubble, bodies covered with sheets, whole neighborhoods flattened. Hunger deepened into malnutrition. Potatoes, when found, were hoarded. Ersatz food was the rule: barley coffee, cabbage soup, bread mixed with sawdust. Children shrank, women's bodies ceased menstruating. Illnesses spread. The black market was survival. A wedding ring could buy flour. Farmers closed doors out of fear. Theft from state stores became common and went uncondemned. Propaganda did not stop. Posters still declared "resist" and "every sacrifice counts." But they no longer inspired. People walked past without looking. Salutes became automatic gestures, hollow and empty. Quiet defiance appeared in small acts: a feigned illness, a broken machine, a poem slipped into a lesson, a son hidden from recruiters. Not rebellion, but dignity in silence. Moral collapse was visible. Women traded sex for bread or soap. Children stole from corpses. Hospitals overflowed. Cemeteries ran out of space. Churches stood empty, their bells silenced. Faith in the Reich had been buried under rubble. By 1945, defeat was no longer deniable. Refugees crowded roads, fleeing the Red Army. Rumors of atrocities were not rumors but warnings. Mass rapes, executions, villages burned. Panic spread ahead of Soviet troops. In the West, Americans and British occupied towns more orderly, but with the same finality. The party dissolved overnight. Armbands were burned. Portraits of Hitler thrown away. Officials vanished or hid as victims. But truth no longer needed names. It lay in the ruins and in the absence of millions who would never return. The camps were revealed. Civilians were marched through them, forced to see what had been denied. Skeletal corpses, mass graves, ovens still warm. Shoes, glasses, hair. The smell of death clung to everything. Some wept, others lowered their eyes. Many said nothing. Defeat felt not like liberation, but emptiness. Hunger grew worse. Cigarettes became currency. Interrogations and tribunals followed. Teachers questioned, officials removed, families left to explain to children what had happened without knowing how. Yet life, even in ruins, went on. Women swept stairwells free of rubble. Men stacked bricks. Children played among wreckage, climbing on burnt-out tanks. Markets reopened with barter instead of money. Slowly, fragments of normality reappeared. But peace did not come quickly. What came first was memory. Germans had to live after surviving. They had to look back at years of silence and obedience, at neighbors disappeared, at slogans shouted until they became meaningless. They had to rebuild not only their houses, but their souls. In May 1945, the war ended. The Reich was gone. But peace was not yet there. What remained was the long, painful task of living after, of teaching children a different world, of carrying the weight of what had been allowed. The banners were gone, the radios silent, the marches finished. The corpse of the Reich had stopped bleeding. What endured was the question of how millions would learn to live without it.